0240 hours local time, the shore anchor holding the Henichesk pontoon crossing to solid ground came apart in a single white flash. The floating road had been in service for 6 days. The drone that killed it had flown roughly 75 miles to get there, low over the Syvash lagoon, and it cost less than $50,000, less than the trucks it caught out on the water. The near span swung loose into the current, with weight still riding on it. Fuel found flame somewhere in the middle of that swing, and the fireball that came up off the deck climbed close to 250 feet, a column of orange and black you could see from 12 miles out across the flats. Russian engineers had finished bolting that crossing together less than a week earlier. It never lasted the month. To understand why a temporary floating road was worth hunting, you have to understand what it replaced. The fixed bridge at Henichesk carries traffic from the mainland out onto the Arabat Spit, and satellite imagery of that bridge shows at least 3 separate impact points punched clean through the deck by heavy Ukrainian anti-bridge drones. That bridge was not the first to fall. The main overland artery into Crimea had already been hit, patched into one-way working order, and hit again days later, until nothing moved across it at all. Between them, the fixed land crossings onto the peninsula had been carrying somewhere between 90 and 95% of everything that moved in or out, military and civilian alike. Losing them did not inconvenience Russia. It rewrote the map. So Russian combat engineers put a pontoon crossing in the water beside the wrecked bridge at Henichesk. It was the obvious move, and for 3 years running, it had been the correct one. When Ukraine last wanted to kill a crossing in this exact stretch of water, it had to spend a cruise missile to do it. $2 million a shot. Against a price tag like that, a pontoon is close to unbeatable. It costs a fraction of a real bridge. It can be pinned together in hours and unpinned just as fast. And no commander in his right mind burns a $2 million missile on something the other side can replace before the smoke clears. That arithmetic had held for years. It was still the arithmetic those engineers were working from when they set the last section and walked back up the bank. What none of them knew was that the arithmetic had collapsed weeks before they arrived. The price of killing a crossing had just fallen below $50,000. They were defending against a $2 million threat, while the thing actually coming for them was cheaper than the first truck that rolled across their new bridge. And Ukraine did not strike that first day, or the next. It let the crossing open. It let the traffic learn the route, let the drivers get comfortable, let the fuel and the freight start moving in volume, because a pontoon nobody is using is just floating steel, and a pontoon carrying a loaded convoy is something else entirely. Look at the ground and the patience explains itself. The Arabat Spit is a sandbar some 70 miles long, and, in places, only a few hundred yards across, with a single road running its length. There is no second route. There is no shoulder wide enough to turn a loaded tanker around on. The crossing at Henichesk is not a shortcut onto the Spit. It is the only door in and the only door out. Russia had built the door itself. Ukraine only had to decide when to close it. They had done the math correctly. They were just working from a price list that was 3 years out of date. And there was something standing on that bank in the dark. Something built for exactly this. Something that should have made every bit of it impossible. The weapon that came for the pontoon that night belongs to a class of aircraft that did not meaningfully exist 3 years ago. Ukraine calls them anti-bridge drones, heavy strike aircraft built for one narrow job, which is to put a warhead through a span and take a crossing out of service. They are not fast. They are not stealthy in any sense a radar engineer would recognize. What they are is cheap, and cheapness in this war has turned out to be a form of firepower all its own. Here are the 2 numbers that matter. One of these aircraft costs under $50,000, and the campaign it belongs to operates against targets sitting anywhere from 12 to 186 miles behind the front line. Put those together, and you get something Russia had no plan for. A weapon that can reach almost anything in the occupied South, and that can be spent freely on targets nobody would previously have wasted a missile on. That is where Russia's defense of this crossing actually failed. The air defense around the Henichesk approaches was not badly built. It was built correctly. For the threat it was designed to stop. Picture a jeweler who spends a fortune on a vault door. Steel plate, hardened frame, a lock that would take a cutting torch and half a night to defeat. It is an excellent door, and it works exactly as intended for years. Then someone walks up with a $30 angle grinder and goes through the wall beside it in 90 seconds. The door never failed. The door is still standing, still locked, still perfect. What failed was the assumption underneath it, the belief that the wall was safe, because attacking the door was expensive. Russia had built its vault door around a $2 million missile. Ukraine stopped bringing missiles, and the approach itself gave the defenders almost nothing to work with. The drone came in over the Syvash, the shallow, brackish lagoon that separates the mainland from the peninsula, flat water for miles, with nothing standing on it. Flying low over that surface, an aircraft stays underneath the radar horizon for most of its run. Ground radar does not see through the curve of the Earth. It sees what stands above the line, and a drone skimming the water does not stand above anything until it is already close. Give a crew 15 seconds of warning. Generous, on that terrain, at that altitude, and inside those 15 seconds the drone covers close to 1.5 miles. By the time a missile clears the rail, the aircraft everyone is arguing about is no longer where the argument started. It is over the water off the anchor pit, nose down, already committed. But killing a pontoon is not like killing a bridge. Ukraine had learned that the hard way, and the lesson had cost it a great deal more than $50,000. A fixed bridge is bone. Break it and it stays broken, because concrete does not knit. A pontoon is not bone, it is the splint strapped over the break. And you do not defeat a splint by hammering on the splint. You cut the straps. A floating crossing is a run of separate sections held in line by joints between them and held to the earth by anchor cables running to the bank. Punch a hole through one section and Russian engineers unpin it, float in a spare, and the road is whole again by afternoon. That is the expensive lesson Ukraine had already paid for. So the aiming point stopped being the deck. It became the pit on the shore where the cables tie down. Standing over that pit was the system that was supposed to end this story early. The Pantsir S-1 is Russian point defense, the innermost layer, a truck-mounted mount carrying both guided missiles and a pair of rapid-firing autocannon. It exists to guard the things that guard everything else. When Russia deploys long-range batteries, the Pantsir is what stands beside them so that nothing gets close enough to matter. It reacts fast, it reacts automatically, and against the threats it was drawn up to face it is genuinely very good, which is the trap. The Pantsir is a fielder trained on the fastball, everything about it, the reaction time, the engagement envelope, the whole design logic, assumes something coming in hot and high and fast, a cruise missile or an aircraft, the kind of target where speed is the problem to solve. An anti-bridge drone is not a fastball. It is a bunt rolling down the chalk line. Right direction, wrong speed, wrong height, moving so slowly and so low that the fielder's instincts work against him instead of for him. The bunt is not a better hit than the fastball. It is simply not the thing anybody practiced against. And there is the second problem, which is arithmetic again. A Pantsir round is worth several times the drone it is fired at. Even when the system works perfectly, Russia loses money on the exchange. Then the reconnaissance feed showed something that changed what this raid was even about. Not far from the crossing, work was already underway on the crossing that would replace it. Dirt tracks that had been dirt tracks for decades were being surfaced and paved. New approach roads were being cut toward the water. And in the channel itself, Russian engineers were not assembling another pontoon at all. They were building an embankment, a solid causeway of earth and rock pushed out from the bank, the kind of structure that has no joints to cut and no cables to sever because it does not float. Russia had planned for this pontoon's death before it died. The men driving across it were using a bridge their own command had already written off, which raises the question that decides whether any of this was worth $50,000. If the next crossing was already half built and the one after that already surveyed, what exactly does killing this one buy? What follows is a reconstruction. The strike on the crossing is documented, the shape of the traffic caught on it that night is drawn from what this route was carrying and how it was carrying it. The column came on at a crawl, because a pontoon does not let you do anything else. Escort vehicles first, freight behind them, and down in the belly of the formation, the fuel, the cargo the whole peninsula was short of, the reason the road existed at all. Each floating section sank and rose again as the weight moved over it. Bumper to bumper, single file, no lane to pass in, no shoulder to pull onto, no water shallow enough to scatter into. Halfway across, the drone was already off the shoreline with the anchor pit in its reticle. It did not go for the deck. It went for the ground. The warhead came down into the pit where the steel cables tied the floating road to a concrete block on solid earth. The block came apart. The first cable snapped, and the second one, and the near end of the crossing simply stopped being attached to anything. Then the current took it. The lead section turned broadside. It dragged the section behind it out of line, and that one dragged the next, and the whole road began to fold sideways in slow motion, with the column still riding on top of it. A truck slid, hit the rail, jackknifed across the span, and stopped the vehicles behind it dead. Somewhere in the middle of that fold, a tanker went over hard enough to open its shell. Fuel does not explode when it spills. It waits. It pools along the buckling deck, it turns to vapor in the warm air over the water, and it looks for a source. It found one. The flash ran the length of the deck faster than a man can turn around. Then heat did the rest of the arithmetic. Valves warping, fittings tearing loose, vapor finding the next flame and the next. Vehicles at the front could not go forward, vehicles behind could not go back. And underneath all of it, the road kept swinging out into the lagoon, taking the fire with it. There was never a plan to destroy that column. There was a plan to take away the ground it was standing on, and let 100 tons of moving weight do what warheads would have taken all night to finish. The only door onto the Arabat Spit had closed, and whatever was already out on that sandbar was staying there. Count what one anchor cable bought, a crossing gone, and gone in the way that matters. Not holed, not damaged, but detached, swung out into the lagoon, and no longer a road. The column riding it stopped being a supply run and became wreckage on a sandbar. And this was not an isolated result. Over one stretch of that campaign, Ukrainian forces struck 7 road bridges, a railway bridge, and 2 temporary crossings between Crimea and the mainland. When the accounting settled, less than 10% of the traffic that had been using the main crossings was still getting through, squeezed onto a bypass route far to the east. Weeks later, Ukrainian forces went back and hit the road bridge over the Henichesk Strait again. The hunting did not stop when the pontoon sank. The pontoon was never the point, because the target here was never concrete, or steel, or floating deck sections. It was choice. Russia entered this fight with several ways to feed the peninsula. Fixed bridges, rail, ferries, road. Every crossing that died did not just remove one option. It funneled everything that had been using it onto whatever was left. And the moment Russian engineers picked the next place to put a crossing, they were doing Ukraine's targeting for it. Build a pontoon, and you have announced where the traffic will be. Pave a new approach road, and you have announced it earlier. Push an embankment into the channel, and you have announced it in a way that shows up on commercial satellite imagery weeks before the first truck rolls. That is the trade. The embankment Russia is building cannot be cut the way a pontoon can, but it also cannot be moved, cannot be hidden, and cannot be finished quickly. Ukraine bought that. It paid under $50,000 and forced its enemy onto a crossing that takes months to build and stays exactly where everybody can see it. Meanwhile, the peninsula it feeds is still rationing fuel by the jerry can, still capping what a driver can buy in a day, still waiting on a road that keeps not arriving. Russia never ran out of bridges. It ran out of places to put the next one. So here is the argument worth having. Killing a crossing your enemy can rebuild in a day looks like the definition of wasted effort. until you notice that he has to rebuild it somewhere, and that every rebuild costs him more and hides him less than the one before. Is that attrition working, or is it just an expensive way to lose slowly? Tell me where you land, down in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns built like this one, subscribe and turn the bell on. The next operation is already on the table.